On July 8th in 1741, there was a small church in Enfield, Connecticut, that their pastor was away on an obligation, and they needed a substitute preacher to come in. And so they got a pastor from another church in a small town not too far away. And that preacher came on July 8th and began a sermon, and he never finished it. It was a sermon that he had preached at his church not too long ago that had pretty normal effect on his congregation, what had been on par with how his congregation had responded to sermons. But this congregation had a quite different response that was so dramatic he couldn't even finish the sermon. You see, around this time, sweeping through the U.S. colonies was the beginnings of a revival that would come to be known as the Great Awakening. And all these New England towns were responding to the gospel in ways that they hadn't responded before, except for this town in Enfield, Connecticut. They were pretty obstinate. They were not responding or participating in this revival at all. But then this pastor came in and preached this sermon that he had preached to his congregation before, and it had an amazing effect. He couldn't finish it because the people were so moved. They were moaning, they were weeping, they were crying out loud for salvation. Some of them were fainting. And it wasn't the words in the sermon, it was what the Spirit was doing with that sermon on that congregation. The preacher was Jonathan Edwards. The sermon was sinners in the hands of an angry God. And if you've never read that sermon, it is worth reading. He envisions for the people a rebellious individual standing over the gap of hell itself, hanging on by just a spider's web, just one single thread of a spider's web. And this changed these people. And that began to spread throughout all the colonies to what we know as the Great Awakening. But it started with a sermon about the anger of God. When's the last time you heard a sermon on the anger of God? And what's more than that, how often do you hear a sermon on the anger of God that doesn't sound like the pastor himself is quite angry with the congregation? Yet anger is one of God's perfections. And it's an attribute that He possesses without which He would be less than God. You can't just edit out some of the less desirable attributes of God and think that He would be unchanged. No, He is who He is. That's why He said to Moses in the burning bush, I am that I am. Not that I am that what you want me to be. I am that I am. You come to me as I am. And our God is also, along with being a holy God and a loving God and a caring God and a righteous God, He's an angry God. That anger is on display in Isaiah chapter 9 and 10. And we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 8 through Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 19. I invite you to turn with me to Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 8. And we're going to do a study on the anger of God. 6 observations from this passage that we make about the anger of God. The first observation in verses 8 through 12. The first observation is this: God's anger is always justified. Always justified. Let's read the text. The Lord has sent a word against Jacob, and it will fall on Israel, and all the people will know, Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, who say in pride and in arrogance of heart, the bricks have fallen, but we will build with dressed stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will put cedars in their place. But the Lord raises the adversaries of Rezin against him, and stirs up his enemies. The Syrians on the east and the Philistines on the west devour Israel with open mouth. For all His anger has not turned away, and His hand is stretched out still. Now that phrase at the end of verse 12 is repeated in verse 17. It's repeated in verse 21. It's repeated in chapter 10 and verse 4. For all of this, His anger has not turned away, and His hand is stretched out still. For all of the sins among His people, for their obstinate behavior, because of that, His hand is stretched out still, and His anger has not turned away. In other words, what they were doing justified the anger of God, vexed His glory, violated His holiness, and so He was right to be angry. Let's look at what justified exactly the anger of God. In verse 9, in verse 10, we see what in verse 9 it says, in their pride and in their arrogance of heart, they say the bricks have fallen. So the bricks were destroyed, but we're going to put beautiful cut stones in their place. And the sycamores may be cut down, but we're going to put bigger and more powerful trees in their place. It just reminds me so much of America post 9/11. You knock down our towers, we're going to put a bigger tower there. And we did, but America was changed. That tower did not heal America. And they're saying the same thing, and God is looking at their pride, and He's looking at their arrogance, and He's saying, because of this, I'm angry. Pride is a unique sin. Pride is what turned angels into demons. It's what cast men from paradise. It's what inflicted the death sentence upon humanity. Pride and arrogance. Not only that, but let's look at verses 16 and 17. We see why God has His anger on His people. In verse 16, for those who guide this people have been leading them astray, and those who are guided by them are swallowed up. Therefore, the Lord does not rejoice over their young men and has no compassion on their fatherless and widows. For everyone is godless and an evildoer, and every mouth speaks folly. For all this, His anger has not turned away, and His hand is stretched out still. So not only are they proud and arrogant, but they were godless evildoers who went astray. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 6. You know that verse. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned what? Not to God's way, turned to his own way. And for this, His anger has not turned away. This is saying that we choose a path without God. Generally, left to our own condition, we choose a path without God. And if God weren't angry at sin, He would be complicit in that which is contrary to His nature. So His anger is justified. How many men here among us would sit complacently with indifference as your wife is brutalized in front of you? How many women here would be dispassionate if a creep lured your child into a van and drove off? No. You would be angry, and you would be righteous in your anger. And so sin angers God. For when that which is most precious is violated, anger is justified. We see pride, we see arrogance, we see evil, we see going astray, we see disgraceful speech. It says every mouth speaks folly. My footnote says disgraceful things. And so, is it Proverbs 6? It says life and death is in the power of the tongue, and how you speak determines so much in your life. And the New Testament says so much about how we speak. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 4 and verse 6. I think we have that. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving, a contrast of what kind of speech should come out of our mouth. Now verse 6, let no one deceive you with empty words. Words are important. For because of all these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. So your speech ought to be different than the sons of disobedience. And there's so much speech that is disqualified in the New Testament. Not just cursing and bitterness and complaining and gossip and vulgarities, all kinds of speech that is not honoring to God. That's one of the reasons why God was justified in His anger. Look at verse 19 and verse 20. It says of chapter 9, through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is scorched, and the people are like fuel for the fire. No one spares another. They're turning on each other. They slice meat on the right, but are still hungry. They devour on the left, but are not satisfied. Each devours the flesh of his own arm. He's talking about the tribes of Israel as if they were one body. They're devouring themselves. Manasseh devours Ephraim. Ephraim devours Manasseh. Together they are against Judah. And for all this, His anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. So betrayals are one of the things that elicits the anger of God. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 15 uses very similar language. Galatians 5:15. In the New Testament, talking about the church, he says, you guys are backbiting each other and you're devouring each other. Be careful lest you be completely consumed. So turning on each other, betraying one another. And one last one in chapter 10, verses 1 through 4. Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor from my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil, and that they may make the fatherless they prey. What will you do on the day of judgment, in that ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? And where will you leave your wealth? Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners and fall among the slain. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. God's anger was justifiable because they were abusing the vulnerable. So they were proud, they were astray, they were wicked, they were ungodly in their speech, they were abusing the vulnerable, and they were turning on one another. And for all this, God's wrath has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. Verses 13 through 17, to pick up where we initially left off. In verse 13, we see a second observation about God's anger. Not only is God's anger always justified, but God's anger is sometimes discipline. Look at verse 13 of chapter 9. The people did not turn to him who struck them, nor inquire of the Lord of hosts. So the Lord cut off from Israel head and tail, palm and branch, and reed in one day. They didn't turn to me when I struck them. So I took away all their leaders. And we see in verse 15, the elder and the honored man, that's like the head. And the prophet who teaches lies, that's like the tail. And for those who guide this people have been leading them astray, and so God cut them off. But in verse 13 and 14, we see the intent. God's anger is sometimes discipline. The Lord wanted to be their guide and their God, but they rejected that. They chose false guides. They went after other paths. And so he struck them with the intent that they would turn to him. But they did not. When God sets his hand against his child with the intent to draw them back to him, that is what we call discipline. And I want us to think about three words that are often confused in the life of the believer. The word testing, the word discipline, and the word temptation. And they're confusing sometimes because we muddle them together in our mind. Of course, Satan is always trying to get us to be confused by it. But let's put up the definition of testing and the definition of discipline. Testing is when you are walking rightly with God, and then he exposes you to some difficulty. Oftentimes it's a suffering of some sort, but his intent is that you would choose him. You're walking right. He exposes you to some suffering. The goal is that you would choose him. And he wants you to succeed in that. He's rooting for you. And there's no anger involved in that at all. Discipline, on the other hand, is when you are walking astray. You are choosing sin. And God exposes you to the consequences of that sin with the intent that you choose him. And in that case, there's a loving anger that God has. It doesn't mean that he hates you, but he's loving you. He's disciplining you and wanting to bring you back to him. Now, a third option that I don't have up there is temptation. And God has nothing to do with temptation. We know God does not tempt. He can't be tempted by sin. He doesn't tempt us to sin. The whole fight, and Satan can take either one of these scenarios, testing or discipline, and he can make it into a temptation. And the difference between a temptation and a testing or discipline is what outcome is being rooted for. When Satan tempts you, he wants you to turn away from God. He wants you to reject God's ways. He is rooting against you, and that's what makes it a temptation. But God is either testing or he's disciplining, and he does it sometimes with anger towards his children, but only because he is so hurt by their sin, and he knows that sin will hurt you as well. Google's not a bad research tool. It can be for certain topics. You got to read with discernment, but you have access to so many good minds. And this is some thoughts from John Piper. I go to, there's a website called gotquestions.org. That's a pretty good resource. And obviously it's not infallible, but I found this article talking about discipline in connection with condemnation. Because sometimes when we're being disciplined by the Lord, as it says in Hebrews, it feels like, man, this doesn't feel pleasant at all. I feel like I'm being punished. I feel like God doesn't like me. God's punitive anger, that is, His punishing and condemning anger, is completely absorbed by Christ when He died on the cross for those who believe in Him. So that punitive anger, that punishment that's meant to condemn, that's not for us. He bore our sin. But God may still at times be angry or displeased and grieved towards His children, His beloved children, in a disciplinary sense rather than a condemning sense. So think about 1 Thessalonians 5:9. We are not destined for wrath. So we're not going to be under God's condemning judgment. But 1 Corinthians 11:32. When we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined so that we may not be condemned along with the world. And that's the heart of what discipline is. It's a temporary exposure to God's anger, that you may not be eternally exposed to God's anger. And it's not the same as contempt. We can look at someone we love with disapproval of their behavior, but that's different than having contempt for someone that disgusts you. And God never looks at His children with contempt. He's always for us. He's never against us. He has the goal of restoration for those who are sinning. And so sometimes God's anger is discipline, particularly when it's towards His children. You think about discipline. Who gets disciplined? Children get disciplined, right? Who else gets disciplined? Students. We got a lot of teachers in this church. Students are disciplined. Who else are disciplined? Athletes are disciplined. Soldiers are disciplined. All different ranges of life. And discipline has the spectrum of anything from training to punishment. It all falls under that same category of discipline. And here's how I would define, especially both components of discipline. Here's how I would describe discipline. Discipline is an artificial stress in a controlled environment that's meant to make you succeed in a more difficult environment. An artificial stress in a controlled environment. Think about the soldiers. They're doing push-ups all the time, right? There must be a lot of push-ups required when you're at war, right? No push-ups required at all. It's an artificial stress to get them equipped for a more dangerous situation. Or here's another way to describe discipline. It's a controlled replica of more severe and real consequences to be avoided. A controlled replica of more severe consequences that need to be avoided. So how many people here, raise your hand, were spanked by your parents? If you're a minor, don't raise your hand, but those of us that are adults, I don't want to expose any parenting here. What were they doing? They were hitting us, like maybe if I hit my brother, I would get hit, but in a way that taught me, like, you know what, out in the real world, if you hit somebody, you might get shot or you might get arrested. So I'm inflicting a little bit of damage here to try to teach you. It's a bubble. That's what discipline is. And sometimes God expresses His anger in a way that's meant to restore. So sometimes God's anger is discipline. We'll move on. There's a third observation that we need to make, and I kind of see it in verse 16. It's really not explicit in the text, but it's obvious in the context here. And that's the third observation, is that God's anger is never impatient. It's never impatient. In verse 16 it says, "For those who guide these people have been leading them astray." This is an ongoing situation. God wasn't reacting in a moment to one particular sin. This is something that was progressing for many generations even. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 15 and 16. A little smaller, but I think you can read that. "The Lord, the God of their fathers, So we have multi-generational offenses here. Sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people until there was no remedy. So God was not behaving hastily. He was taking his time. And he does so still even today. In Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 46, Jesus uses a very similar analogy. He talks about the vine dressers that were caring for this vineyard, and the owner kept sending messengers, and they kept abusing the messengers. Finally, the owner sent his own son, which would be symbolic of Jesus Christ, and they murdered him. It's the same picture that we have from 2 Chronicles here. God's anger is quite patient. He's not like us. When I'm angry, almost always, almost without exception, if I'm angry, it's because I got impatient. Right? Probably you too. God is never impatient in his anger. God never loses his temper. He behaves precisely, accurately, righteously, just as he intends. He is never out of control. And his love and his anger is patient. Isaiah chapter 48 and verse 9, he talks about his anger being deferred and restrained. Even when he executes his anger, he controls it because we wouldn't survive the full expression of his anger. Only at the cross and only in hell is God's anger poured out undiluted. But God is holy. He is patient. When I'm angry, I'm impatient and I'm selfish. When God's angry, he's patient and he's protecting his holy glory. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. 1 Peter 3:9 says that don't mistake God's failure to execute judgment as being slow, as some count slowness. He says, no, he's being patient towards you, not willing that any should perish, but desiring that all would come to repentance. So God is patient with his anger. A fourth observation in this study on God's anger, and we see it quite clearly in verses 18 and 19. God's anger is often perplexing. It's always justified. Sometimes it's disciplined. It's never impatient, but oftentimes it's perplexing to us. Look at verse 18. The wickedness burns like a fire. What's burning like a fire? The wickedness. The wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It kindles the thickets of the forest. What is it? The wickedness is doing that. And they roll upward in a column of smoke. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts, the land is scorched. What's scorching the land? The anger of God, the wrath of God. And the people are like fuel for the fire, and no one spares another. So you see the wickedness being symbolic of the fire sweeping through the land, and God's anger also being a fire. Look in chapter 10 and verse 17. It says, the light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame. It will burn and devour. So we see the glory of God being just a flame above the altar, a light growing into a flame, growing into a scorching fire that consumes the land. But what I find interesting and perplexing here is, what is the fire? Is it the wickedness of the people, or is it the wrath of God? It seems to be kind of both at the same time. Or also look at this. It says, no one spares one another. Right? In verse 19 of chapter 10. It says everyone is devouring each other. Well, is that the offense that drew God's anger? Or is that the judgment that God afflicted upon them? That they would devour one another? Mysteriously, inexplicably, it seems like it's both. Sometimes, from our limited perspective, we cannot distinguish between the sinful actions of people and the sovereign anger of God. Have you noticed that in your life? Sometimes we cannot distinguish between the sinful actions of people and the sovereign anger of God because he's using the sinful people like instruments in his hands to execute his judgment. We see this very clearly in chapter 10 and verse 5. So he's angry at his people. His hand is stretched out still. His anger has not turned away, and he's going to execute judgment. How is he going to execute judgment? Look at verse 5. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger. The staff in their hands is my fury. The staff in Assyria's hands is God's fury. Against a godly nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take the spoil and to seize plunder and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. So God's using the king of Assyria to do this. Look at verse 7. But he does not so intend, and his heart does not so think. But it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, and not a few. So God's saying, I'm going to use him to destroy my people, but he doesn't think he's doing the judgment of God. He thinks he's doing it for himself. And so we have this strange thing where this wicked man is unwittingly an instrument of God's judgment. And we see that also towards the end of the chapter in verse 15. Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against him who wields it? He's saying King Sennacherib is just an instrument in my hand. He's the axe, and I'm cutting down Judah and Israel with that axe. So he's using a sinful man's sinful actions to execute his righteous and holy judgment. That's mysterious. It's perplexing. We don't understand it. God's ways are inscrutable. He is beyond us. But I can think of other places where this took place. Acts chapter 2 and verse 23. This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and the foreknowledge of God. God didn't just see it, he planned it. You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Somehow, God used lawlessness to accomplish his perfect purpose. That's what we have here in Isaiah. So God's anger is often perplexing. And just as a takeaway, when someone sins against you, don't dismiss it if they're wrong. Sometimes God uses other people sinning against you to teach you something. I can tell you, in this season of our church, I'm definitely implementing that in my life. I'm not going to dismiss anyone that brings an accusation against me, no matter what heart set it came from in them or what their goal was in giving it. I need to ask God, what are you teaching me in this? So don't dismiss it, don't qualify it. Sometimes God uses sinful people to teach us something. His anger is often perplexing. Real quickly, chapter 10, verses 10 through 16, we see that God's anger is only impartial. Impartial is not the same thing as indiscriminate. Indiscriminate, like he's not just angry towards everyone. Have you ever been angry at someone and then you took out your anger on a third party? You come home, you're angry at something at work, man, and you take it out on your family. God's not like that. So that would be indiscriminate anger. God's not like that. God doesn't just rage and show his anger on whoever crosses his path. What it means is he doesn't show favorites. That's what it means when he's impartial. It says a couple times in the New Testament that God does not show favor over one group over the other. In Acts chapter 10, verse 34 and 36, he's not a respecter of persons. He gave grace to the Gentiles just like he did to the Jews. In Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 2 and verses 6 through 13, he says he's not a respecter of persons. Just because you have the law doesn't mean that you're not going to be judged by it. It's the followers of the law that are not judged. And so God doesn't show favorites, and we see that in verse 10 and 11. Look what he says. As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do so to Jerusalem and her idols, as I have done to Samaria and her images? God's people in God's land had idols, and God judged the foreigners for their idols. And here he's saying, am I not going to judge you for your idols? Israel had forgotten what it was that had made them special. They had forgotten what it was that had set them apart from all the nations. They took God's favor for granted. This is a word for us. They took God's favor for granted, and they expected to retain his mercy while despising his ways. God is not going to continue to bless a people that despise his ways. And it doesn't matter how Christian they confess themselves to be. If you despise God's way, He will not continue to bless you. That's what we see here in verse 10 and 11, because His anger is impartial. And the second example of this we see in verses 12 through 16, where He goes on to punish the king of Assyria, because Syria punished his people, and in his pride, he thought that he was the one that did it. Look at verse 13. The king of Assyria says, "By the strength of my hand I have done it, by my wisdom, for I have understanding, and I remove the boundaries of peoples, and I plunder the treasures. Like a bull, I bring down those who sit on thrones." So Sennacherib, unaware that God was using him, in his pride, thought he had accomplished it, and God, being impartial in His anger, punished Sennacherib then. We see that in verses 15 through 19. We actually have I think we have an image of, if you look closely at these, you can find this in the British Museum. These are the relief carvings that he put on his palace wall in Nineveh, and it's recognized. Those are the tribes of Judah that are being killed. Those are the Judeans that are begging for mercy. Their heads are being cut off, and this is documented. And this is exactly what we see take place here in Isaiah. Because God's anger is impartial, He used Assyria to punish His people, and then He went and He punished Assyria. Real quickly, final thought, final observation. God's anger is ever glorious. It is impartial, it is patient, it is perplexing, it is justified, but it is glorious. God executed His anger because Sennacherib tried to rival God's glory. And that's the thread throughout the entire book of Isaiah, is people trying to rival God's glory. And God's glory will not be conceded to anybody else. And so He executes His anger to guard His glory, to protect His glory, to defend His glory. And we see that again and again throughout the book of Isaiah. His anger is tied to His glory. Chapter 30 and verse 30, last verse to put up there, I think. "The Lord will cause His majestic voice to be heard, and the descending blow of His arm to be seen, in furious anger, and a flame of devouring fire, with a cloudburst and storm and hailstones." You see that His anger is being described in majestic terms. It is proper to attribute to God the anger that He displays as one of His righteous attributes. He's revealed it to make His glory known. I think we actually have one last verse to put up there. If you're studying Isaiah, you really need to get a grip on Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11. It's very confusing. It's going to be difficult. I by far don't have it figured out. But in that passage, he talks about the question in Romans 9, 10, 11 is, has God turned His back on Israel? Is He done with Israel? Has He rejected Israel? And he's answering that question, and here's what he says. What if God, desiring to show His wrath and to make known His power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of His glory for vessels of mercy? Here's how I would rephrase that in my own words. God's saying, I showed my wrath to make known my power, to display my glory to those who receive mercy. We see God's anger, we see His glory. So the question is, what are we going to do with this as we think about God's righteous anger? Let me just quickly give you, and let's have our worship team come up. We'll close with a song after this. Appreciate your patience. What are we supposed to do with it? God's anger is justified, so we need to avoid it. And there's only two ways to avoid God's anger. One, don't ever sin, and you will avoid His anger. That's off the table for most of us, I would say. The other one is the gospel. As simple as that. We go to the gospel. God poured out all of His anger at Christ on the cross, the full cup of His wrath, it says, and He's never going to punish Christ again. Never. God is never going to pour out His wrath on Christ again. So if you want to be safe from the wrath of God, by the gospel, we must be in Christ, where God will never pour out His wrath again. So God's anger is justified, and we need to avoid it. God's anger is discipline. We need to respond to it. God's anger is patient. We need to count on it. Just because he's delaying his anger on sinful people doesn't mean he always will. You can count on it. His anger is going to be executed. He will defend his glory. His anger is perplexing. We need to discern it. His anger is impartial. We need to fear it. His anger is glorious. We need to esteem it. So, may we not respond to his anger as Judah did, with hubris and with unearned confidence. May we come to God and his anger lowly, broken, and blessed.